Good morning. We're here for the budget briefing, the beginning of our new budget process in the year ahead. I think I'm going to give you the old charts again and fewer. So this is consistent with our budget prudence that we're going to have 2 charts instead of 5 charts. Now, I want to just start right here with this chart. Because this thing is so graphic and so emblematic of the problem that California faces. And that is the red always far outweighs the black. And the years of surplus are very few in number and very modest, as you can see, both in the earlier period and now in the most recent period. And the deficits are much larger in magnitude. And that really is the challenge of California. We can explain that if we look at this other chart, where the top line is what we expected the growth to be at the time of our budget proposal a year ago. Then, when I signed the budget in June, we already had to lower our estimate, and now in this budget, we lowered even more. So, 2 points. One, the trajectory of revenue growth is declining, number one, and number two, but it's still growing. So compared to many other places in the world, particularly places like Europe, where they're struggling with no growth, California is growing, but less than we expected. And for that reason, we would have had a deficit had we not engaged in certain budget cuts, and if we didn't get the benefit of certain tax measures that were passed on the ballot. Again, the point is that California has the most progressive tax system in the United States. We do ask those who make the most money to pay the highest percentage of taxes. But as a corollary, we have one of the most unreliable revenue systems in the country. And to manage unreliability requires prudence. It requires that we keep a very close eye on the balance in our budget. And while we have sometimes the highs, they're always followed by the lows. The tendency, the inevitable mood is that when we're toward the end of a recovery, we have all this money and people want to spend. That's the very time when you have to pull in and provide a budget reserve, build up the rainy day fund. That's just the way it is. If you want a progressive tax system, you have to have a very big reserve and rainy day fund. And a rainy day fund, while it may look big with $8 billion, another billion in reserve, the fact is that a modest recession will cost California $18 billion a year for 3 years. That's what the finance department says. So they could be off by quite a lot, and we would still be in deep trouble. And I don't think it makes any sense or even very decent to pretend we've got money when we don't, because having it means having it over a whole budget cycle. And to spend and then cut and then have all those problems that we saw under Gray Davis and under Arnold Schwarzenegger, I don't want to repeat that. So this is not just some kind of quirk or legacy or brownieism. This is just the corollary of a progressive tax system. And until you're ready to change that, which some people are, and I'm perfectly willing to work with them, we must maintain a big reserve. And that's what we're going to do, because I don't want to see that go back to that cuts. And we're going to get a recession. We've had 10 of them since World War II. We're now in almost the third longest recovery from those recessions. So the downturn is inevitable, and the only way you can balance it, like good farmers who know that you can have almond prices $6 a pound, they get down to 3 or 4, and you got to save your money or you lose the farm. We're not going to lose the programs. We're going to keep them going, and that is the whole purpose of this exercise, although I realize in the whole legislative process, spending tends to be at a higher level than I think prudence would allow, or which I'm going to go along with. So I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Governor, if the Trump administration cuts Obamacare as they've been planning to do, what impact do you see this having on California and the budget specifically?
Well, the law currently says that if the federal revenues drop more than 30%, the law is automatically repealed. But I'm not going to anticipate anything. The bill has not moved through the Senate. I don't think there's a politician in American history that could ever imagine taking away health insurance from 20 million Americans. That's a very a bold and I think a move that it isn't very consistent with decency or even with being a very smart political leader. So I know the Republicans are on that track, but the reality is going to be far more difficult and far more disruptive than they're now expecting. So I'm not going to anticipate what we'll have to do, but suffice it to say, if they do go down that road, it will be extremely painful for California. But we'll respond in the best way we can at that point.
Governor, what's your view of the legislature spending $25,000 a month to hire Eric Holder to do a job that it appears to some that Javier Becerra is also doing?
No, it has nothing to do with Javier Becerra. He's the Attorney General, and the legislature does from time to time hire outside counsel. They did in the electricity crisis. I think they have done it in other areas. So he will give them good counsel, and I look forward to having an opportunity to meet him once again.
Governor, talk a little bit about affordable housing. Your administration recently put out a report calling it a crisis, noting how far behind California is. What does your budget do? I see it's about $3 billion. Is that enough, do you think?
Well, I think we're doing quite a lot relative to this, to the housing market. There's a big gap there. Now, you probably noticed if you look in the budget, the average subsidy cost is about somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think, $430,000. $332. San Francisco at $600,000 per unit. That's what it costs to subsidize a family, at least the initial upfront cost. So it is very expensive. We're talking probably to cover the whole thing would be tens of billions, maybe hundreds of billions. So I think it's always going to be rather incremental. And so what we can do is cut the red tape, cut the delays, cut whatever expenses we can afford to do without to make housing more affordable and therefore increase the stock and therefore hopefully bring down the cost. I mean, there are big issues, and we're going to spend what we can, but that's another one of these needs that will be there for a long, long time to come.
Governor, are you and the legislature doing enough to rein in rising pension costs?
Well, we've done more than at any time in the history of California and more than most other states. Our pension reform, despite a few uninformed critics, was a major, major reform. And it wasn't as far as I wanted to go. It's not as far as we need to go. But it was very significant. I don't think we should minimize that. The reduction from assuming 7.5 return to 7, that's another major step. I think the pension board, the PERS people will continue to look at that. There are cases going on through the courts that are redoing the pension rules. So I would say that this will be a lively topic, but I think we've taken some solid steps. But in something so delicate and so political, I would say we're doing about what could be expected, and we'll continue to take advantage of opportunities as they come up.
Governor, given the uncertainty from the federal government and how it may affect state finances, do you foresee a situation in which you and legislators would have to revisit the budget in the months after it is passed and signed?
Hard to say. If the worst, you know, if they're talking about cutting massively, not even just in terms of the Medicaid program, we'll have a big challenge on our hands. But I'm not going to try to anticipate that. It's another reason, though, like the volatility of the revenue, that the legislature has to be very prudent this year. There are too many uncertainties that could put a massive hole in our budget expectations. So that's just another argument to be prudent, and who knows? By the way, this revenue could go up between now and May. I'm not saying. It could also drop another $10 billion. This budget can move very quickly, and that is what I call riding the tiger. That's part of being a progressive state that asks the most affluent with all their capital gains to pay more. And they'll pay more, but in certain years they're going to pay a lot less, and that means we got to have a big reserve.
Governor, I noticed you'd like to get a 2/3 vote on cap and trade. Can you talk a little bit about that and why? Do you think it's necessary at this time?
Well, it's a very important program as part of our climate change strategy. California is one of the leading forces in the world dealing with climate change. Cap and trade is not the whole response, but it is an important program, and it generates some important funds. And I'm going to work very hard to win legislative approval for that program. It's a good one. I would think that, given the fact that the federal government seems to be going in the opposite direction, that Californians may want to strengthen their own commitment, because the world is really looking to us. And given the fact that California now is a part of a worldwide coalition of more than 160 states, regions, and even countries, that we ought to continue and not fall back in our efforts.
Governor Brown, a follow-up on that one, on the cap and trade. How does California plan to respond to the climate change denial in the Donald Trump administration? And does the rest of the world now look to states like California for leadership from the U.S. in this?
Well, we're going to respond by continuing our efforts to do what we're doing, and even embrace more efforts as they become available and plausible. California has been part of an effort to enlist countries and regions and states and provinces in the Under 2 commitment. That's the Under 2 MOU, which says keep carbon pollution down to 2 million tons per person, and keep the climate no more than 2 degrees centigrade above the industrial period. That's what we're committed to. And so many other states and regions have joined with us. So yeah, I don't know, I wouldn't say the whole world's looking to California, but we're looking to the rest of the world to be joined in a very powerful coalition. And the science is getting stronger, not weaker. The West Antarctic ice shelf, which has an 11-mile split and crevice that's growing, the science is not going to change, and therefore even the reluctant opponents are going to have to join in, because you can't deny the tide comes in, the tide goes out, the climate is changing. All the scientific studies show that. So I'm very optimistic that what's going on in Washington is a pause, not a new direction.
Governor, if you're serious about California maybe launching its own satellite if the Trump administration stops collecting data, and if so, where's that money going to come from?
Well, first of all, I don't see any evidence yet that the president is going to stop collecting climate data. That was said by some of the transition people and has not been picked up. So hopefully that's not going to happen. But if things really get drastic, I don't rule out any initiative on the part of California.
Governor, the budget projects $105 billion in federal money, up I think close to $10 billion from last year. Are you worried about beyond healthcare, just exposure in general?
Sure, there's an issue. That's why we're going to have to hold on to our hat here. This is going to be a rough ride, and we cannot tell where we're going to be in a few months. The May revision will be a very important time, and we're going to just see what it means. There's a rhetorical thrust that is rather extreme, to say the least. Now, how much that materializes, we'll find out. But whatever happens, we're going to live with it, and we'll deal with it. And we'll be advocates to slow it down, because this funding, I think, is money well spent, money well invested, and I don't think this country needs any more divisive kinds of moves that divide the poor and the rich and split the middle class and all those other things that will be the result if the rhetorical thrust, as suggested in the last few weeks, becomes the operational reality in Washington, which I certainly hope and will work to make sure that it doesn't.
Governor, one other housing question. Last year you unveiled a very particular or specific proposal. This year you have a list of principles. Why the change in that approach?
Well, I still like the proposal we had. It's not the only proposal, and we're looking for participation. And the last time we pushed it pretty hard, and some people said we didn't collaborate enough, so we're setting principles out so we can collaborate. But I do think you got to bring down the cost structure of housing, not just find ways to subsidize, which will in fact raise the cost if you go very far down that road.
Governor, both university systems are poised to raise tuition a modest amount. Do you think those proposals are necessary given the support, the added support that you've given them in the budget in the past few years?
Well, our budget does assume that they will hold tuition down. I've recognized that at some point reasonable tuition changes are probably needed. But I do think the cost structure has to be lowered. And while they've made some effort, I think there's far more that can be done over time. And I would suggest to the universities that they figure out ways of bringing their cost structure down over time, because inevitably, as we can tell from this chart, the budget will be cut. And therefore, what they need to do is to build reserves and to build resiliency in their programs and not just invoke this amorphous term quality as the justification for more and more spending.
What do you think of the future of recreational marijuana in California, given the likelihood of Jeff Sessions as the federal attorney general?
I have no idea. I'm sure if history is a guide, it probably has a bright future. If you're asking me, are people going to stop? I doubt it.
But is there going to continue to be a commercial marketplace?
That I don't know. I have no.
He's been very critical of the Obama administration's hands-off approach on that.
Look, there have been a lot of changes in several states, including California, and those changes will have to be digested. So sometimes you take a step forward and then a step backward. But I think people will be able to satisfy this particular need in one way or another.
Is there money for a massive legal response if the California population becomes vulnerable to mass deportations, and if California's Muslims become subject to Muslim registries? Does California have a financial plan for legal representation?
Well, we have some money in the budget now. There are cities that are doing things. I think the legislators may have some ideas. We're not going to get hysterical, but we're going to be prepared to protect the rights of all the people in California in a thoughtful, creative way.
How is the budget going to affect undocumented workers? You guys, California was trying to get some sort of medical care for them. Is this going to affect them in any way?
Well, we still have programs for children of undocumented workers. We still have an educational program that spends additional money for those schools that have families that don't speak English as the first language. So there are a lot of things we do, and we'll continue to do those no matter what happens in Washington.
And then, Governor, you've had an extension of, while you're expecting total revenues to go down, you have some new revenues, the extension of the Prop 30 taxes, and you've got the new tobacco tax. How are you proposing to use that money? How much does that help with the projected deficit?
Well, it's helping to pay for medical care, and that's what it was designed to do. So they are helping to plug what would have been a deficit, which is now part of a balanced budget.
Governor, you said up front this budget does include cuts. What's being cut?
Well, we're taking the Prop 98 and putting it at the minimum level. We're deferring some capital outlay on state building and some other expected growth in programs such as child care we're not funding. So, and a few other things.
Governor, do you expect pushback from the Democratic legislative leaders and the budget chairs on this proposal?
Generally, there is pushing and some shoving back and forth. And I would expect that to be done in a very civil but vigorous manner in the months ahead.
Governor, what do you say to voters who might be experiencing some cognitive dissonance after November, in which they approved 2 tax increases, and yet here we're seeing a budget where you're seeing a projected deficit and talking about even more caution and prudence than before? It seems like that might be hard to square to people who just approved additional tax increases.
Well, actually, they're pretty consistent, given the uncertainty of our budget and the fact that we have so much red ink. You know, in fact, I got a red pen here just so I could kind of put that in a big circle, just so you remember. That's just the way it is. We're riding a volatile revenue system. We also have, on the other hand, we're spending $1.8 billion more on Medi-Cal, on the Affordable Care Act. So we need the money. We got the money. So we'll spend it prudently, and hopefully we'll have enough reserve, and we won't get this big budget recession for a few more years.
Governor, can you explain your position on Prop 51 spending, the school bonds? It seems like you're saying you're not going to spend any money until there are reforms. What was your thinking going into that?
Well, we're going to try to make it work in the fairest way possible. The way it works now is the more well-financed and sophisticated districts have their proposals all ready to go, and some very deserving school districts can be left behind. So we want to make sure that the rules, consistent with the Bond Act, will work to take care of those most in need.
Governor, the legislative analysts had their big 3 revenues growing much larger than yours. How do you square the pretty large difference between them?
Well, I think they had them growing more last year, and it turns out that they don't seem to be growing that much. But if they are growing, when it comes around to May, we'll take a look at it. We're in very uncertain times. I mean, anybody thinks they can predict the future finances, the economy. We're very subject to a lot of unpredictability. So that's the point, whether it's the new administration and what they might do to money that would normally flow to California, or the economy itself. I think it is time for caution. And I find it somewhat ironic that the fiscal watchdog of the legislature is basically saying we have more money, so you should spend more. I remember a time when the fiscal watchdog was always saying, hey, be careful, spend less, Mr. Executive, than you want to spend.
Governor, can you talk a little bit about how you'd like to...
What?
Sorry. Could you talk a little bit about how you'd like to see a funding plan come together
The what?
for transportation infrastructure fixes?
Well, the transportation plan just comes together because we put it together. Now, the question is, how do we get the votes? And that involves Republicans, involves Democrats, involves different interest groups, and we work to forge a consensus. It is challenging, but I'm very committed to finding the revenues to fix California's roads.
Governor, do you think you can continue to grow a greener, low-carbon economy in California, given some of the appointees that the Trump administration seemed to be putting in?
I believe that the science of climate change is clear and getting stronger. The consequences of the changing climate is real and can be quite devastating. Therefore, wise people will respond sooner or later. So this, at most, I think is going to be a delay. But we have, it's not a, can we afford a green economy? Can we not afford it? I mean, if we start getting climate disruptions, rising sea level, heat waves, destruction of our crops, the migration of dangerous tropical diseases, we're going to do something. And part of the doing something is mitigating the carbon emissions and slowing them down. It's not a choice. It just happens to be a political pause that will not sustain itself in the face of science.
Governor, some lawmakers have proposed spending some money to help undocumented immigrants who are facing deportation proceedings. Is there anything like that in this budget?
Not new proposals. There's some older spending that we've made available for people that have immigration issues. I'm sure the legislature will put things out, and we'll look at that along with all the other proposals. When we spend more, then we have to find ways of cutting elsewhere. So everything is always open over the next few months to discuss.
What is this budget doing to address water usage throughout the state, whether it be agriculture or just residential?
Well, the budget continues with the water bond spending. There's a variety of grant programs and other assistance. We're helping people in the Central Valley with fresh water when their wells have dried up. We're supporting innovation of various kinds, water recycling, stormwater capture, more efficient use of agricultural technology. So we're doing all that, and we'll continue. It's very important.
Governor, aside from fiscal restraint, are there aspects of the budget that reflect the uncertainties and challenges that may come from the Trump administration?
No, we can't, budget something that hasn't happened yet. And if you look at the wide array of very drastic initiatives that are being talked about, either by the transition or commentators or by President Trump himself, that's quite a challenge. But I don't think we can put it in this budget, assuming everything's going to take place. I mean, there are already cracks in the Republican Congress on various topics. So there'll be a lot of division, a lot of debate, and at the time of the May revision, we can take a look at where we are. It could be very serious, or it may not be so
Governor, the
drastic.
future of many students, undocumented students, is uncertain for obvious reasons. Now, speaking statewide, financially wise, would there be any backing for them or any security?
For what?
For the students and their future education?
Backing, well, there's a lot of backing. We're spending billions of dollars both on higher education and tens of billions of dollars on kindergarten through 12th grade, and money in child care and other programs. So California is spending quite a lot of money for education. I think people can take advantage of that and should take advantage of it.
Now, speaking rumors, speculation, I think it's been tossed around here and there. Mass deportations, does this budget include having the thinking about the mass deportations taking, and how would that negatively affect the economy with the dozens of thousands of immigrants that reside here in California?
Well, California has definitely benefited from the waves of immigration that have occurred historically and in recent decades. So we're very cautious. I mean, we're very concerned about any big shift in immigration policy. So we'll be watching that very carefully. And the legislature's very concerned, and so am I. So we will just take a look at what's happening and figure out what can California do to respond to protect all our people. And have no doubt, we will be vigilant, and we'll do whatever we can.
The Trump team has talked about defunding state programs in states that don't cooperate on immigration deportations. Has your team looked at vulnerabilities to the budget if there are federal funds withheld?
No, and I think this is really more localities that have various programs, and not all localities have the same program. So I think that's something that will work itself out over time, and each city and each county has to look at that, as well as the state of California.
We've got Michael Cohen to answer more specifically.
Yeah, Mr. Cohen knows more than I do about this. So, Michael, you want to come up here and... Well, I'd say he's won the first vote. That's good. Not so good that some Republicans voted against it, and I hope that isn't some signal of the Washington disease spreading west. But I'm looking for collaboration with the Republicans as well as the Democrats. And I'm hoping they'll take a little more open look at the nomination. This is a good person, well qualified. I think he's very sensitive to the needs of all the people and will represent people no matter what their party. And so I hope that this does not become a partisan issue and we reproduce the dysfunctionality of Washington. That would not be a good thing.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I just want to run through some overall budget numbers for you, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. Before I do, I just wanted to thank the staff of the Department of Finance, as well as throughout the executive branch, for all of their hard work in putting together this budget. As you heard, absent the proposals in the budget, the state would face a budget deficit of almost $2 billion, $1.6 billion and therefore the budget proposes $3.2 billion of actions to bring the budget back into balance. Roughly half of that is rebalancing our Proposition 98 minimum funding guarantee for K-14 education down to the minimum guarantee. So we shift some funding around. There's still growth in the guarantee going into next year and into the future. So education funding, the local control funding formula, will receive roughly $700 million of funds to provide a cost of living increase and keep the formula at 96% implemented. We're pulling back on a number of one-time spending proposals that were included in the 2016 Budget Act. Those dollars haven't gone out yet. So as the governor mentioned, one of them is $300 million for the state building fund to continue to our progress on Sacramento office space for state workforce, the $400 million for affordable housing that we had set aside in last year's budget is another example of that. And then finally, we are reducing some spending expectations, things that if revenues were higher, that we would have gone forward with proposing, but due to the budget situation have not. So overall budget numbers, the general fund is proposed at $122.5 billion. That's roughly flat, a decline of 0.2% from current year spending. All funds is $179.5 billion. That's an increase of 1.1% from the current year. Just to circle back to the question regarding the ballot measures that passed in November, in particular the tax measures, those have all been accounted for and reflect. Otherwise, if not for those ballot measures, there would have been a larger budget deficit. But it's worth remembering that Proposition 55, the extension of the income tax rates under Proposition 30, has no effect on the upcoming budget year. The Proposition 30 income tax rates go through calendar year 2018, and so Proposition 55 will help us stay in balance beginning in 2018-19, a year from now, and then its full effect is really 2 years into the future. But whereas when the governor signed the budget in June, he raised concerns about multi-billion-dollar shortfalls in the long term. Under the proposal we have before you today, the budget would remain balanced for this upcoming year and for the following 3 years into our forecast. And then just to come back to the issue of federal uncertainty, obviously a number of your questions dealt with that. We have certainly done a lot more scenario planning and thinking about all the possibilities. However, this budget simply notes that there is a great degree of federal uncertainty based on the new presidential administration coming in and statements from Congress, but we'll wait and see. The budget reflects the current operation of law, and so we'll just need to be nimble and react to what happens, and we'll reflect that in the May revision and going forward in terms of any changes. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Just on the, you have the summary chart of general fund expenditures by agency.
Yes.
And you know, some of the ones with these huge reductions, you know, government operations, which is like minus 60, labor and workforce like minus 30. Are those from like the one-time expenditures?
Exactly. The reductions are really a reflection that we spent so much money in the current year budget on one-time funding. When we did the expenditures like the government operations, there was $1 billion to start that state office fund. That's not being made again in the upcoming year, and so you see a decline year to year, but it's really more a reflection of the 2016 budget than on true cuts.
Michael, you say in the budget reflects a $65 fee for new car purchases.
Right.
What other fee and
tax increases are in the budget?
Sure. The big tax increases are in the transportation plan. It's roughly the same plan the governor has put out since September of 2015. The $65 per vehicle is a big chunk, as well as eliminating these year-by-year fluctuations in the gas tax that have been really hard to plan for in the transportation community. So we would set the gas tax at 21.5 cents and increase it for inflation. Those are the major proposals, and obviously implementing the hospital fee extension that was in Proposition 52, the extension of the tobacco tax increase in 56. Those are by far the big dollar amounts. There's smaller fees that are increasing for inflation or to reflect higher spending.
So by setting a gas tax at 21 cents per gallon pegged to inflation, how much additional would that raise?
It's $700 million. Is that the right number a year? On
Together about $5 billion.
you're talking over
Over the 10 years.
over a 10-year period, about $5 billion. The overall transportation package is $4.3 billion a year. Most of that is related to the revenue increases, although it also reflects greater efficiencies from Caltrans and the expenditures of the cap and trade money on transit and other alternative transportation.
So that 4.3 includes cap and trade.
Correct.
Speaking of cap and trade, so just the mechanism for the release of those funds, it looks like, is a little bit different. So you're saying trying to peg that to a two-thirds vote to extend it?
That's right. One of the, as those of you who've been following this, you've seen the quarterly auctions have been particularly volatile over the last year. We think one of those reasons is some of the uncertainty about the program's long-term future, and so we're seeking a two-thirds vote to extend the program to eliminate any possible uncertainty, and then at that point, once that passes, we would be in a position to allocate $2.2 billion of cap and trade revenue.
Like high-speed rail, for instance, which automatically gets a quarter of
That's
it.
included in the 2.2. So 60% of the money is allocated according to law continuously as set forth by the legislation. The other 40% gets allocated. But I think the key is that until we get certainty in the program, that $2.2 billion, we're not at all clear that it's going to materialize unless we have program certainty.
Sorry, to be clear on that, you're saying the continuously appropriated cap and trade money is also subject to the two-thirds?
No, I mean, whatever comes in will go to those programs, but it's probably going to be considerably less without some certainty for the program.
But you're not stopping spending that money?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And $500 million for high-speed rail out of cap and trade?
Is that the? It's 25%.
I see you're planning to phase out the middle-class scholarship program.
That's right.
Is that because the program was ineffective?
So right now there's 37,000 students that are benefiting from it. We're making sure that anyone who's already receiving a scholarship will continue to get it, but I think it's more a reflection, not that it's ineffective, it's a prioritization of our dollars, that we clearly have less money than we thought, and so in order to preserve our Cal Grant program, which provides funding to lower income students, we're making a difficult choice and proposing to phase out that program.
So how much is saved by doing that?
$30+ million in this upcoming year. It grows to about $100 million when the students currently receiving scholarships graduate and work through the entire program.
Michael, on repealing the driver's license suspensions, now is that just for traffic infractions, or is it a bigger class?
It's for uncollected debt. That there doesn't seem to be a link between the fact that you've got debt from fines and penalties and court-ordered debt and your ability to actually pay. What ends up happening when you lose your driver's license is you can't go to your job, go to your school to pick up your kids, those kind of things, and there hasn't been a real link that we found between taking away someone's driver's license and that actually encouraging more payment.
But is that for like DUIs, for non-payment of child support?
It would not, I don't believe, on child support, but anything sort of in the uncollected, court-ordered variety.
So if you're removing that incentive, I mean, how much do you expect to lose? And
That's the point. We don't expect to lose anything. There's been some research that shows that there's really no connection. So we don't think there will be a revenue effect on that. Yes.
What's the most significant change you think you've made to the HHS budget?
I mean, I think the most significant change is that this will be the upcoming first budget where the state's paying for a share of the optional expansion with kind of the federal ramp down of their assistance. So we're adding about $800 million of general fund spending to reflect that we're continuing coverage for 4 million individuals that the Affordable Care Act weren't receiving coverage.
So, sorry, just to be clear on that. So you're saying basically as the state share of Medi-Cal, the Medi-Cal expansion spending grows.
Yeah.
That's what that is.
Yeah.
And it's $800 million?
It's $800 million for the increased cost for the optional expansion compared to the current year to the upcoming
What is the state share right now?
It's 2017 calendar year is the first year we're at 95%, then it drops down to 94% on the federal side. So
within the judicial branch, Chair, is there any additional money for court construction or to backfill some of the revenues the courts might feel that they lose from the non-collection of the back revenues you were talking about earlier?
There's $55 million of backfill of declining fines and penalty revenues.
The trust fund revenue.
Right. So otherwise that would lead, if we didn't backfill, that would lead to a reduction in court funding. But there's no proposal on construction that there is those dedicated funds for construction, and we'll continue to fund as many projects as we can with the revenue source that we have. But right now it's pretty much tapped out.
Can you explain structurally how the Prop 51 proposal works? Are you able to tie the legislation to actually spending the money? Is that how that would work?
Yeah, the bonds have to be sold,
right.
And so what we're saying is we will sell bonds once a combination of state law and the regulations change. There was an audit that came out in June that delineated a lot of the inappropriate spending that had occurred in the prior bond program. So I think the key is we continue to have a commitment to the taxpayers to make sure that every dollar that goes out through that program is being accounted for appropriately. And so we've got a proposal for some front-end accountability, making sure everybody knows the rules, and then making sure that we audit appropriately at the back end so that we're not catching these things years after the fact.
Sure. And is there money in this budget for debt service for that, or would that come in?
There is some, but you tend to not pay the debt service until months after the bonds are sold. So it's really more a factor for the upcoming year, 2018-19.
To piggyback on that question,
yeah.
We cannot change the way that the money is distributed, right?
The initiative clearly locks in many aspects of the program, but we don't think the voters intended to sort of forsake taxpayer accountability on making sure the bond funds are used for what they were intended.
But that is the bigger problem. That's what the governor is.
Most of the program is locked in place, and so we are sort of handicapped in making a program the most effective possible, but the budget proposes to do what we can within the confines of Proposition 51.
Is there any interest in legislation that would change the distribution of the funds for the next state bond, which would be many years from now?
There was certainly interest in the legislature last year before the bond went to the ballot. The stakeholders, those that benefit directly from the bond funds, had no interest at that time. I don't know what their position is now.
On the
K-12 this year?
It's right. So this year, so over you've got the chart there. Over the 3-year period, it's 1.7 billion less than what would have been anticipated based on our prior revenue projection. So, but every dollar that we've committed to school districts and community colleges in last year's budget and the current budget will continue to go out. We're just having to shift it into 2017-18. So they'll get their checks a little bit later, but they'll continue to get every dollar that's been appropriated to them.
So they don't need to make current year cuts to their
Correct. It'll just end up being a timing issue and a lowering expectation of how much growth that they'll be getting in the upcoming year. But there is, if you flip to the third figure in the introduction, there's or actually you've got it there too, right at the bottom of the page. There's the chart that shows sort of growth year over year. So the Proposition 98 guarantee will still grow to 73.5 billion. Under Proposition 55, we're seeing growth long term in the guarantee, but this budget is really an adjustment of expectations of how much new money they're going to get.
So the first year when the smaller amount shows up as a result of this change is in 17-18?
Yeah, I think in the past few years we've been able to accelerate the expected implementation of the local control funding formula. The current year got us to 96% implemented. That's well ahead, billions of dollars ahead of schedule from when it passed. And rather than continuing to be able to get to 97 or 98% this upcoming year, the budget's basically just providing enough money to stay at 96% implemented.
Just for the Prop 56 allocations, you got that chart
Yeah.
there. Republicans have called for using, I think 200 million or so of the money for a year for Medi-Cal. I see that there's an allocation for the state dental program. What is that, and do you guys do anything with Medi-Cal or have any thoughts on the Republican?
That's sort of the public health program. It's required allocation under Proposition 56. We don't have a proposal akin to the Republican proposal to raise rates for all of the dentists that we're already paying in the Medi-Cal program. The proposal on the Medi-Cal side and the 82% allocation is to basically prevent any cuts in Medi-Cal funding, and so we're using the $1.2 billion to fund increased costs in Medi-Cal going forward.
What is the latest estimate for the fiscal year that LCFF will be fully funded?
It's not changed until 2020? 2021. And that hasn't changed. I think that should still be on an 8-year schedule.
So we had been pretty far ahead.
Yes.
We're far ahead. We're still 4.4 billion ahead.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just circle back on Medi-Cal. I mean, what's kind of the rationale for that? You had two really devastating state reports last year on it, and this will be at least the second budget in a row. I think third budget in a row where there at least isn't an increase to to the program beyond what Medicaid would
So it's if you want to spend $200 million there, you've got to take away $200 million from somewhere else in the budget, particularly in a year in which you have a projected budget deficit. It's really of paramount importance to protect as much as we can of our existing programs and services and rates, and what we have to forgo providing more money to do some of the same activities.
Question about housing policy. You state no new general fund impact for any general fund.
Right.
Does that include things like reallocation of funds? There's one bill that would take money from the mortgage introduction for second homeowners and reallocate that to subsidies. Another one that would add a fee on real estate transactions. Is that sort of statement?
I mean, if you're reallocating, I haven't looked at the specifics of those proposals, but if you're talking about reallocating existing money from one thing within housing to another, that's a different conversation than adding new costs to the general fund.
And same with adding new fees. Is that
a new fee doesn't necessarily have to impact the general fund. So if you raise revenue and spend it on something, there's generally not going to be a general fund impact.
Are there any plans for short-term borrowing?
No, we, for the third straight year, I don't foresee the need to do any cash flow borrowing that are, despite this small budget deficit that we're correcting, we're still in a dramatically better fiscal position than we have been in sort of over the last 15 years or so. And one of the benefits of that is we don't have to spend millions of dollars on cash flow loans to make sure we pay our bills.
Michael, if I'm understanding this right, it's $3.2 billion for grants and loans related to affordable housing.
That's right.
And that's like a range of different spending, but
Correct.
it's no new general fund spending in this.
It's the continuation of the existing general fund spending that we have. We don't have any housing reductions proposed, so it's the continuation of the existing programs we have. The big new thing is the second year of the No Place Like Home allocation, the bond against Proposition 63 funds. So that's another $260 million. That's new money that we're working as hard as we can to get that money out on the street. And that will be new money that has never been allocated for a program before.
And how much is that, sorry?
It's right at the top of the chart you were looking at. 263, is that? Let me just double check the number.
262. Got
262, off by $1 million.
In terms of long-term bond issuance, how does this budget in terms of planning for long-term bond
Right.
issues, how does it compare to the previous one?
Similar to the last few years where we are expecting to make general obligation bond sales in both the spring and the fall. We've done, compared to pre-2011, a dramatically better job at managing our bond cash. So at times when we got here, there was $10 billion of cash on hand that wasn't ready for actual program use. And so one of the reasons that we've been selling less bonds than previously each year is because we only sell them when the projects are ready to go. So we'd sort of expect a similar level of bond sales in the low billions of dollars that we've had the last couple years. Yeah.
Can you please clarify the point about in here the increased Medi-Cal program budget of $1.8 billion and that $800 million that you mentioned?
Sure.
So
So you're mixing 2 years. So the $1.8 billion is the current year, 2016-17. Basically, the Medi-Cal general fund budget is $1.8 billion higher than what we expected when we passed the budget in June. It's due largely to some one-time factors, some misestimating related to the coordinated care program, as well as the need to repay some federal rebates that we had just missed in the timing of that. The $800 million I cited on implementing the Affordable Care Act is the growth in spending for the optional expansion under the Affordable Care Act from the current year, where we're spending about $800 million general fund, and we're going to double that to $1.6 billion between the current year and the upcoming year.
Question with regard to the federal funding and lawmakers on the Hill have said as of January 20th noon, they will begin cutting off federal funding to California with regard to sanctuary cities. That was Representative John Culberson, who's at the Appropriations Committee. Have you all figured out like what they can, what are the estimates here? What's the potential? And what steps are taken in the budget to balance?
There is no specific proposal related to that in the budget. However, we are considering all sorts of scenarios that we wouldn't have been thinking about in October. But at this point, there's no proposal in the budget. We'll wait and see if anything's adopted by Congress.
And then general funding is general fund funding is spending. It's flat.
Yes.
But the special funds, when you add the special funds and bond funds, the total budget still grows by about $8.5 billion.
Mm-hmm.
What are the? I mean, I think you've touched on it already, but just to be clear, what are the primary drivers?
So I think the transportation proposal is implementing that is a clear example. Another good example is the extension of the hospital fee under Proposition 52, so that provides a bump in special fund revenues over what we're expecting. So those are a couple good examples.
Thanks.
The revenue differences between you and LAO are pretty stark. Can you elaborate a little bit on where you are less optimistic than they are about?
Sure. I think we're across the board seeing softening in our revenue forecast. The income tax, the sales tax, and the corporate tax. The LAO agrees on the corporate tax and the sales tax relatively closely. They're much more bullish on personal income tax revenues, as they have been in a number of years. They have a considerably higher forecast of capital gains, which is notoriously difficult to forecast. I think you could go back and look now that we're basically closing the books on the revenues for 2015-16, the prior year. If you go back and look at the May revision from 2015, you'll see they were about $3 billion higher than us at that point, and we ended up coming in less than $500 million higher than what Finance's forecast was at the time. So there's obviously a great degree of uncertainty that the LAO has highlighted, and we get a lot of our income tax dollars in April, and that's why we've got a May revision. So we'll take another look at it a few months from now.
Are you all being kind of intentionally conservative in the budget in the revenue projections?
No, we always take our best shot at what we think they're going to be, and our professional staff did nothing different this time in preparing their revenue forecast. But we have over the last 7 months since the governor signed the budget, we've had 7 months of revenue. 5 of those months have come in below projections, so we're really reflecting the cash trends that we've been seeing to date. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
70 injured in bombings in the Afghan capital, Kabul. NPR's Nishan Tahia reports.
The first bomb exploded near a parked minibus. The second when the police arrived to help the victims. A female lawmaker from western Herat province was among those injured. The Taliban have claimed responsibility. This wave of violence comes after a period of relative calm in the Afghan capital, Kabul. Elsewhere in the country, there was a bombing in the capital of Helmand province in the south, and an explosion in Kandahar, also in the south, wounded the United Arab Emirates ambassador to Afghanistan. 7 others died in that attack. Nishan Dahia, NPR News.
Wall Street at this hour, the Dow is down 11 points at 19,876. This is NPR. In Central Europe, icy temperatures and snow continue to cause chaos across the region, with the death toll rising. Esme Nicholson reports migrants moving across the continent are particularly at risk of exposure.
In the Serbian capital of Belgrade,